Well, thank you so much, Greg, and thank you for the Society for the Rule of Law. It is, I consider it a point of light, as the first Bush would say. And you may not think there should have to be a Society for the Rule of Law. These things should be taken for granted. I might agree with you, but I'm so glad that this society, this organization exists. So thank you to them for doing what they do. I'd like to set the stage with some quoting, with a bit of quoting. I've been thinking about these matters lately, and by lately I mean this morning and for the last several years. And I don't know about you, but things that I used to think of as sort of cliches or banalities have become all the more meaningful to me in recent years. For example, a republic if you can keep it. You know, it's not just a good line or a quip. For me now, it's all the more meaningful. I've jotted down some other things. I suppose the first president I was intimately acquainted with, so to speak, the first president whose presidency I really followed was Jimmy Carter. And I remember when he campaigned in 1976, he would say, "America should have a government as good as its people. We deserve a government as good as the people." And I thought, yeah, well, you really want to be elected. But, but it's a nice line. And I just wonder, in any democratic society, in any free and open society, is the government basically as good as the people? That could be a touchy, even a painful question. Next president, Ronald Reagan, who said over and over, "Freedom is always a generation away from extinction." When he said this, and I admired him a great deal, I must say I sort of rolled my eyes, at least inwardly, because it seemed a little, I don't know, a little too strong. You know, there's a great deal of ruin in a nation, blah, blah, blah. But in recent years, think of the example of Venezuela. That was a generation or less. Here, this country was thought of as sort of a model for South America, democratic, prosperous. Now it's a police state that is half starving, and 8 million people have fled. Going back, and Lindsay Chervinsky can quote all these things by heart, that famous letter of John Adams to the Massachusetts militia. And there's a famous line, maybe people in this room can recite it by heart. And the famous line is, "Our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate to the government of any other." But I learned only recently the line that precedes that. Now, I think it was quoted by David French. And I don't quote it much in writing because of the slipperiness of this word gallantry, which to us is basically a positive word, to be gallant. And Adams used it negatively. It was very much a negative word. And he says, "Avarice, ambition, revenge, or gallantry would break the strongest cords of our Constitution as a whale goes through a net." And I think that was a natural image for a New Englander to use, as a whale goes through a net. And it seems to me just sort of blindingly true. In recent years, we've talked about guardrails, our constitutional guardrails. And I have thought more and more that these are not so much paper protections or paper arrangements, but human beings. The guardrails are flesh and blood. So as I see it, Mike Pence was a guardrail on January 6th, a human guardrail. Stephen Richer in Arizona was a flesh and blood guardrail. One more thing before I conclude this monologue and turn it over to our panelists. I've been quoting this lately. I think it's from Andy Warhol. Art is what you can get away with. And that Marshall McLuhan said some variation on that as well. And I believe that the incumbent president is testing what can a U.S. president get away with. The answer is a lot, a lot. Can you put yourself on a coin front and back? Yes. Can you remake the White House physically, all on your own, just on your say-so? I guess you can. Can you pardon virtually every convicted criminal who supports you politically? I guess so. I'm not sure this has really been tested. So the thing about our panel is all about norms and Republican virtues and things that really aren't written down
things you just do because that's the way we do things here. But they're not written down. So that is my scene setting, so to speak. And maybe start with Lindsay Chervinsky, who's written a book about atoms, about Washington, and so on and so forth. And so my question will be a very sophisticated one. Lindsay, what do you think?
Well, thank you so much for setting that scene. You all hear me?
That'd be great with Lowe's.
So when the Constitution was written, in terms of writing things down, it was just over 4,000 words. Once we added all of the amendments we have today, it is just over 7,000 words, which is the second shortest written Constitution in the world.
Yeah.
After we amended it all of these days. And
Sorry, I half-asked what the shortest is. You can't say second, leave me hanging.
I believe it is Japan.
That'd be written by us Americans, too.
Yeah.
Yeah, lyrics some things by then, so we were able to cut some stuff out. And, largely this was because they were trying to create a document that was a series of compromises to get the maximum number of states to ratify it. And the more you wrote down, the more likely you were to offend someone. So fewer words and vague language was the name of the game. That was goal one. Problem two was that George Washington was sitting in the room. And it is pretty hard to flesh out a full presidency when the person who's going to be holding those problems or holding those powers is sitting right there, is the most famous person in the world at this point, has already demonstrated that he can be trusted with enormous authority because he was willing to give it back. And talking about any misdeeds would have been incredibly awkward and uncomfortable. I think they also trusted him to fill out what I call the sort of fuzzy bits of the presidency, the day-to-day. How do you dress? How do you interact with citizens? How do you interact with the other branches of government? And they were willing to kind of let most of it play out. So much of the political system, especially the federal system, is based on a series of practices that were fleshed out in real time over the first, let's say, 15 years of the early republic. And we had the extraordinary good fortune that most of those precedents were really quite sensible. And they were thought out carefully. Washington weighed each decision as though a life depended on it and wrote to friends about the weight of precedent that he was building. And then we've had the extraordinary good fortune that most of the people that have followed Washington, while none have been perfect and every one has been flawed and made mistakes, genuinely tried to adhere to those norms and customs and precedents. And we have learned in the last decade or so just how much of the system isn't actually written down and how much depends on good faith, how much depends on character. One of my favorite quotes is a letter John Adams wrote on November 1st. He actually wrote the letter on November 2nd, 1800, after spending his first night in the White House, which was November 1st. And he wrote to Abigail and he said, "May none but honest and wise men ever rule under this roof." And it was a recognition how much character desperately matters, how much goodwill and good faith is built into the fabric of this system.
Jonathan Rauch, when we elect our politicians, we say something about ourselves, don't we, in a free country?
We do. Before responding, I just want to thank everyone for coming, and not only my panelists, but all of you, every individual in this room, both by being here and by doing the things you're doing outside this room, is helping our country and our democracy. I'm also wearing an advertisement. In case you're wondering, this stands for Who is the Administrator of Doge? This was the obsessive quest, and for all I know still is of my friends at Lawfare, a wonderful, wonderful publication and organization that we should all read and support. So Jay, I just came equipped to introduce the concept of norms by talking about golf for just a second. This is a sport I have never played.
You saved yourself a lot of grief.
I do not know the rules, and yet I am reliably informed that it depends on norms. There's a lot of definition of norms. One I particularly like is from my friend David Frum. Norms are basically ways of making things that are not designed to work better than they should. In other words, they're the way to take cumbersome laws and systems and figure out, in a day-to-day sense, how to keep them going and what we all need to do that. Okay, so I did a little reading on golf, and one of the things I learned from The Guardian is that golf is a test of character. They say, want to find the true makeup of a person? Take them to the golf course. Want to see if they pay their taxes? Watch what they do when their ball lands in the rough. You all can tell me later what a rough is. If they cheat on the golf course, they are cheating at life, and so on. Now you can see where this is going. There is a book by Rick Riley called Commander-in-Cheat: How Golf Explains Trump. Among the things it says is that he lies about his lies. He fudges and foozles and fluffs. At Winged Foot, where Trump is a member, the caddies got so used to seeing him kick his ball back onto the fairway, they came up with a name for him: Pele. A review of Riley's book summarized it thus: Trump lies about his handicap, about the quality and reputation of his courses, about the profitability or lack thereof of these operations, and even about how much he actually plays. So, what do we do when we encounter a person who not only breaks the formal rules, but breaks all the informal rules and gets away with stuff that no one would even think to try? There's videos of him having his ball repositioned while he's on the court. What do you do not just about norm violations that are secretive, as Nixon's were, but that are flagrant? It turns out what we've learned is something I've called the weaponization of flagrance. By violating norms so openly, so brazenly, and so repeatedly, you can accustom people to these violations and make them seem normal. And that's probably the aspect of this that worries me the most. The sorts of things that are happening now, which were literally unthinkable even a few years ago. And the one, to conclude, that worries me the most of all is entirely norm-based. And that's the conversion of the Justice Department from an even-handed professional prosecution agency to one that is, in effect, a mob legal arm. There's really no way under the Constitution that I know of to separate the prosecution power from the presidency. For over 200 years, we've simply relied on the integrity of presidents and attorneys general to do things the right way. I don't know how you put that genie back in the bottle.
Well, before we leave the extremely important topic of golf, I want to give you a story to tuck into your repertoire. In the 1925 U.S. Open, Bobby Jones called a penalty on himself. No one else had seen the infraction, but that's what you do. He called a two-stroke penalty on himself, and he wound up losing the Open by one stroke. And when he was praised for this, he was really sort of indignant. He said, "Sooner praise a man for not robbing a bank. That's what we do in this game." And he was offended by the praise. That was a long time ago. Greg Jacob, and Greg, I was thinking, have you had to take the S off your last name your whole life? Do you have to take that? You are Greg Jacob.
Singular. I like to tell people, one of me is enough trouble in the world. Please don't pluralize.
Greg, I have so many questions for you, but say whatever the heck you like here at the outset.
Well, first of all, thanks for having me here. As I reflect on the importance of norms, I feel like there's sort of three categories of things that I've dealt with in a career in public life. You've got your black and white rules, right? Bribery, don't do them. Then you have legally required standards, like take care that the law be faithfully executed. There's not a black and white to that, but it's essentially important. And then I would put norms in a different category, civility in discourse, that we don't pardon people who are just political contributors, like the Mark Dritch pardon with Bill Clinton. And we certainly have seen a number of them in recent days as well. And I think what is so important about norms is that they cease to become norms when we stop enforcing them universally, including against our own. And I think that I've never been prouder than to serve under Mike Pence, because he is one of the very few people who you can point to in public life who took a stand, sacrificing his own political interest, because he understood that he had taken an oath before God to uphold the duties of his office, and he was going to be faithful to that, even if it meant sacrificing his political career, because he understood that he had a duty and a responsibility as the Vice President of the United States to faithfully execute on the duties of that office. And he undertook to understand those. It was actually a lot more complicated than people may think, but he did a lot of deep research on things, and he came to his conclusion. And when he put out his letter on January 6th, he wanted it to be a moment of civic education about why we do these things the way we do them. But in my mind, we have been in a downward spiral for 25 to 30 years in enforcement of norms, because we don't stand up against our own when our own break them. And it has been true of both parties. And I'm delighted to be here. One of my fears is that this organization is perceived as just the anti-Trump organization. And really, the Society for the Rule of Law needs to have a rogues gallery of those who have eroded our norms, who have not faithfully executed their office. That's going to include multiple presidents who came before, who paved these roads. And I'll just give one example, not at the presidential level. I got called before the January 6th committee to testify about my experience on January's 4th, 5th, and 6th, and the days leading up to it. And my great disappointment was that for all the good work that I thought that the January 6th committee did, there was no humility at all to recognize the role that the people sitting up on the dais had played in creating the conditions that led to January 6th. And this is what I mean. If you take a look at the 12th Amendment, which borrows from the original text of Article 2, you will find no indication that the Vice President has any authority to reject electoral votes. You won't. And what you also won't find is any indication that the Congress of the United States has any role in rejecting electoral votes and throwing them out. Congress had decided that they had that authority, and we saw, starting in the year 2000, every time a Republican president got elected, Democrats objected to counting electoral votes. It happened in 2000 with Florida. In 2004, there were actually 32 members of Congress who voted to throw out Ohio's electoral votes. What was the fraud in Ohio? There was none. But there was Benny Johnson sitting up as chairman of that committee, questioning me without recognizing at all that he had helped to establish in the minds of the public the view that Congress had some ability to decide what electoral votes were going to be counted where the state had sent in only one slate. And that simply wasn't true. What had Adam Schiff done, also sitting up on that dais? He abstained. He knew that there was no grounds to vote to throw out the results of the electoral votes of Ohio. Had that vote succeeded, by the way, it would have overturned the outcome of the election in 2004. Ohio was the determinative vote. Jamie Raskin in 2016, a guy I respect a lot for some of the things he's done in Congress. But in 2016, he stood up and tried to throw out half of Florida's electoral votes. He was the one who stood at the dais and said, half of them should be thrown out by this Congress. I object to them. So those things created in the perception of the public the view. And they didn't think they were going to succeed when they did this. They were simply abusing their office for political theater. And nobody stood up and said, this is ridiculous. We can't do this. This isn't the right role for that day. And I could give you a million examples of Republicans and Democrats both, of people not standing up and holding their own accountable to norms. And until we, the people, elect people with a demand that they stand up even against their own when they break these norms, I think that we're never going to get things back to the right side. We cannot live in the tribalism that we currently have.
Greg, I want to ask you, when is it appropriate to object to electoral votes? I mean, are they supposed to rubber stamp the thing? Why go through this process at all? And forgive me if this is Civics 101, but maybe I could use a little Civics 101.
Sure. So in Federalist 68, Alexander Hamilton wrote, there's a lot of controversy over the Electoral College today, but he said, there's a lot of controversy over this Constitution, but the one part that everybody thinks we got right is the Electoral College. And what he meant was we had diffused power down to the states, so there was not going to be, he wrote, any one person and no pre-existing body that was going to get to decide who was the president. And he said, because if we did have a pre-existing body, like the Congress of the United States. By the way, members of Congress are not allowed to serve as electors. That's in the text of the Constitution. That's because they didn't want people who were in that body to have a role in deciding the presidency. But Hamilton wrote, if we had one body where that happened, the result will be heats and ferments inside that building that will extend out to the people on the outside and result in violence. Was Alexander Hamilton right? The framers knew people. The moment that people got into their heads the notion that there was a decision to be made in that building that day that would determine the outcome of the presidency, which again, Democrats had paved that road for 20 years wrongly. Not enough people had stood up against them. The difference in 2020 was that this time you actually had the presidential candidate echoing that. That put things over the top, and we had violence in the building. So what's the answer to the question? The framers believed that the decision was to be made down at the state level. If a state sends in only one slate, that is the slate to be counted. I believe Judge Ludig wrote an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal taking this position as well. You can come up with me with a million horror scenarios about how a state could get things wrong, and you are right. And the answer to this is you cannot pick a perfect final adjudicator of this that you can trust with absolute certainty to get it right. The best solution is to let it happen at the state level. This problem that came up in 1876 is what do you do if a state sends in two slates? And so that there does have to be a solution for because Congress does have to decide, all right, if our responsibility, the Constitution says the vice president opens the certificates and they shall be counted. That's the text of the Constitution. Nothing about objecting, nothing about rejecting. I do get in a two slate scenario, they have to make a decision, well, which one is the one we're going to count, that antecedent question. And I do think that the ECA reforms did help substantially to narrow the slate, the times where that could happen. So, but the right answer is, yes, it happens at the state level, and their job in Congress is to count.
Okay, thank you. Greg Nunziata suggested some questions, all of them very good. And here's one of them. I'd like to comment a little bit on it. See if I can find it here. Here we go, Jay. Are norms alone enough in a polarized era, or do we need harder legal constraints? Let me read that a little better. Are norms alone enough in a polarized era, or do we need harder legal constraints? And I thought of the presidential pardon power. And obviously, pardons have long been controversial. I barely remember the Ford pardon of Nixon, and it was decried by a lot of people, naturally. And decades later, he won from the Kennedys the Profile and Courage Award for that pardon. So sometimes opinion can shift. But I recall, I myself, I think, as someone mentioned, President Clinton's pardons in the last hours of his presidency, the night of January 19th and the morning of January 20th. And I was scandalized by many of those pardons, little writing about them. A couple of members of the Weather Underground he pardoned or granted clemency to. And so I remember I wrote a column about this. In 2002, I was tickled as we say in the Midwest where I'm from. I was tickled by George W. Bush's pardons, and I looked them up this morning to make sure I'd remembered correctly. He pardoned a guy who years before had turned back the odometer on his car. It sounds like a joke. No. He pardoned someone who had made, in essence, bootleg whiskey, untaxed whiskey, and he pardoned a guy who had refused to be drafted in 1957 because he was a Jehovah's Witness minister. And those are sort of quaint pardons, and they're almost cute. But in retrospect, they seem, well, they're very different from other pardons we have known. And so someone like me, and this goes to Greg's question, someone like me might say, if this presidential power is going to be abused in this fashion, but let's just get rid of it. Let's just take it away from him or her. In other words, I must tell you that I, as a writer, sometimes think, editors, close your ear. How do I editor-proof this piece? And I think, how do you Trump-proof, and if you don't like that, choose your own rascal. What do you do about this? And so someone like me might say, darn it, if norms and Republican virtues and customs and just being decent, if that won't cut it, let's write it down. Write it down and enforce it as best we can. So, what do you all think of that, starting with Lindsay?
Well, I think there is always danger in writing something down because you can inherently create problems that you don't necessarily anticipate, and there is no way to anticipate all of the problems that you might need to solve with a particular piece of writing. I do think that there are probably some sensible limitations for your particular example on the pardon power in particular. Whether or not they're feasible under our current constitutional system without an amendment is perhaps a different conversation. But I would like, if I could, to actually address the first part of your conversation, which is the concept of an intensely partisan, polarized time in norms and customs. And I'd like to draw our attention to the election of 1800, in which the norms and customs that we're talking about now were just really getting started. So they didn't actually even have the emotional weight that centuries of repetition granted them prior to their more recent destruction. And, if we think we're in a bad place, at that point, you had weak parties that could not protect moderates or encourage compromise. You had very intense partisanship. Both parties tended to reserve their most vociferous rhetoric for those in their own camp that they deemed squishy or weak. They turned on John Adams, who was the president, for pursuing peace and diplomacy, and called him an evil to be endured. A member of his own party, Alexander Hamilton, wrote a 30-page screed decrying his character because he wouldn't respond to a letter he had sent, in which Alexander Hamilton would normally then challenge someone to a duel, but you can't do that when it's the president, so instead he published this pamphlet. The Federalists were saying that if Jefferson won, he was going to come steal all of your Bibles, so you needed to bury them in your backyard. The Jeffersonians were saying that Adams had a hermaphroditic character, which was quite the slur at the time. And when we got to the election, of course, it famously comes into a tie, and Jefferson and Burr are tied, and so it goes to Congress. And there's a 2.5-month window between when it's clear there's a tie and Congress is actually going to certify the vote. And the part of the story that's not often told is that the Virginia and Pennsylvania militias were stationed on the border of Washington, D.C., ready to march into the district if the Federalists took the presidency from Jefferson. There was a mob outside the Capitol that was at least several thousand strong. The French minister said it was 100,000 strong. Now, 100,000 people didn't fit in D.C. at the time, so he was exaggerating, but it was a large mob that was threatening to kill anyone who took the presidency from Jefferson. And this was before Secret Service, this was before there was a Marshal Service, this was before there was Capitol Police, this was before there was a fence. The threat was so real that many Jeffersonians decades later wrote that they felt that they were basically one night away from violence destroying the entire Constitution. They managed to survive that because the moderates from both parties were able to come up with a compromise that put the Constitution's survival above their own political interests. And I think the reason they were able to do so is because this generation had, in some cases, literally fought in the revolution or had been in the revolutionary governments. They had skin in the game. They understood how difficult it was to build this thing and how easy it would be to tear it down. So I don't think it's necessarily a question of partisanship or polarization that is the threat to our norms. It's a sense that, you know, oh, we've survived 250 years, we're fine, we can survive another 250. When history tells us that most often republics die before 300 years. And so I think the sense that the key difference in past moments of crisis was an understanding, and you know, this is true of Nixon and Watergate, where Republicans were the one that went to the White House and said, you have to go. And this was true in other moments of constitutional crisis like 1876. And I think largely what it is those generations had lived through the Civil War and World War II, and they understood what true crisis looked like and how important it was to set aside differences in moments when it seemed like it was perilously close to ending. And I think we've become complacent, and that's actually what is the destructive force at the moment.
Jonathan?
We do need legal constraints to be tightened in lots of ways, and we all know what they are. The Alien Enemies Act should be repealed. The Insurrection Act should be tightened or repealed. The IEPA powers should be constrained or repealed. Emergency powers generally should be very much tightened and so forth. But I think the burden of Greg's question is correct, which is when norms break down, that's when people go to laws. And laws are much, much less flexible than norms. Norms are subtle and they're supple. Think of the many ways that they can regulate our lives in ways that are less intrusive and more flexible. We've had norms for a long time. A lot of this is broken down in recent years since the sexual revolution, but norms around, for example, out-of-wedlock sex and pregnancy. But these were complex norms. If, for example, the bride was 8 months pregnant at the altar, an entire church full of people were completely capable of not noticing. Norms around adultery, multi-level, very nuanced. Adultery is a bad thing, but it's going to happen, so the man has to keep it quiet, and society could know about it but will overlook it as long as the wife chooses to ignore it. Because you don't want to embarrass her. Of course, it's a different ballgame if she blows the whistle or if he gets too flagrant. I could go on. Norms around end of life. Doctors would help people end lives in ways that were probably illegal. But it was a wink and a nod. The person was dying of cancer and suffering, and the doctor would slip an extra dose. There'd be a quiet hallway conversation with the relatives, and nothing had happened except a natural death. Only norms can do that, and once you begin crashing through norms, you've got two bad choices. One is you simply lose the norms and you're in the situation that we're in right now. The other is you try to use law as a substitute, and law is very slow and cumbersome and brittle.
Jonathan, if you were, let's get illiberal here for a second. If you were czar, let's just say you could force through a few reforms along the lines you were speaking of. Your favorite tightening of a law, writing of a new law, repeal of a law.
I'd go for the emergency powers. Those need to be radically trimmed, and they should all cease without an affirmative vote of both houses of Congress after, say, 30 days. And many of them should just not exist at all, but yes. Another law that this should not be necessary, but Congress ought to forbid lawsuits by presidents and senior members of their administration. We never needed that before, but now we do, so one could go on.
Would you leave the pardon power as is?
I don't think about constitutional change because it's so difficult.
Yeah, you can say that again. Greg Jacob, what say you to all this or any of it?
I do think a constitutional amendment on the pardon power is warranted because as written, there really are no constraints on it. And That's just the reality. And now that the norms, again, I think over a 25 to 30-year period in pardons have been eroded. Very difficult to accomplish because our constitutional amendment process is so difficult. But I think more broadly, in answer to the question, we need both. We both need to tighten a lot of laws where Congress, in dereliction of its duty, has given too much power to the president and not given sufficient standards. That's part of what we're seeing the courts struggling with now with some of these cases where there's a demonstrable commitment of discretion to the president, and courts are required to enforce that demonstrable commitment of discretion to the president without enough standards laid down as to when those should be triggered. And so just letting the president declare an emergency, or, as in the case of the tariffs, suggest that trade deficits alone constitute the kind of emergency, despite the fact that we have another statute that deals specifically with trade deficits, but that can become the trigger across the board. So I do think a lot of tightening needs to be done. It's very difficult to do because unless we sort of create a third party that's just a fix the presidency party, where they're going to run on one issue, which is I'm going to sign a constitutional amendment to fix the pardon power, and then I'm going to sign any bills that Congress sends me to amend these statutes. Presidents veto these things. It's very difficult to get it through because once you get a person in that office, they kind of like the fact that they have all these powers. And every person who sits in that chair is convinced that they will execute them just fine. So they don't have a problem with the fact that all these powers have been entrusted to them. So you really need to have somebody elected who is going to have a demonstrable commitment to fixing those things. But you also need on the other side of it a commitment to faithful execution. I mean, when I was at OLC, so OLC is the office at the Justice Department. It's like the little miniature constitutional law shop within the executive branch. And we could get two kinds of questions, both of which are legitimate. One is, what's the best answer as to whether I have the power to do this? Can I or not? Yes, no, what's the best answer? I love that question. That's right. Built into it is, I want to trust my lawyers to give me the right answer. There's also another legitimate question, which is, what are the range of potentially faithful interpretations of this statute? What are the things I might be able to do? And what are the consequences that might come along with me adopting some of those interpretations? So that kind of question gets asked in the executive branch all the time, and the limits have been pushed on those things. And so unless you have a president and an attorney general and a head of the Office of Legal Counsel who is committed to engaging in that in good faith, you can write all the things into the laws in the world. And I'll just give one example from personal experience is my interactions with John Eastman. There was an admission right up front that, Bill Galston of the Wall Street Journal wrote a piece in favor of fixing some of these laws a couple of weeks ago, and I had to write a response because one of the examples he gave was he said, if only the Electoral Count Act had been reformed prior to 2020, Trump would have had no basis to browbeat Vice President Pence. Completely untrue, because John Eastman admitted to me in the Oval Office on January 4th that every scheme he proposed, even his more modest send it back to the states scheme, violated the Electoral Count Act. The argument was that some vague constitutional text in the 12th Amendment gave the vice president these powers and therefore the statute was unconstitutional. Now, you couldn't get there through a good faith interpretation of the law, but if you took in front of me and you said, here's the Supreme Court's interpretation of the Due Process Clause in Roe v. Wade, and here's John Eastman's interpretation of the 12th Amendment in that Oval Office, which one's worse? As a matter of text, John Eastman's isn't any worse than the Supreme Court's there. So it's why it's really important to, I think, have a commitment to originalism, textualism, and then good faith, because it imposes meaningful constraints on the ability of people to use laws in ways that they were never intended.
I'd like to ask the panelists, and forgive me if this is a simple question, even a dumb one. Is separation of powers holding?
Is that a trick question?
You know, every member of Congress was elected by the people. The people elect the president, who sets the administration, the executive branch, and judges, federal judges, Supreme Court justices. They're nominated, they're confirmed, they're rejected. Jonathan, speak to this.
Well, I was going to send it over to Lindsay, because it just seems to me to be so obvious that Congress is in a state of collapse, institutional collapse.
But it's a choice, if you will.
Well, it's not a choice in
That
keeping
you can choose to
with the
be
design
inactive. Yeah.
It may be a choice. Of course, everything is a choice, but it's a choice that's fundamentally at odds with the structure of our Constitution, which envisioned Congress as an independent branch with a will of its own, and institutional prerogatives which it would defend. That's the core of the Madisonian system. We now have, in practice, the worst of two worlds. We have a parliamentary system being crammed into a presidential box where you've got party-line votes, and the majority party in Congress sees itself as effectively the employees, the staff, the minions of the presidency, but you don't have the accountability of a parliamentary system in which the parliamentary party can, if it chooses, choose a new leader. And that's not the constitutional design. That's something very different.
Yeah, I would agree with that, and I would add further that the founders were very much aware of the possibility of abuse of the system. They talked about the possibility of a demagogue, of people abusing power. What I think they couldn't have foreseen was the idea that hundreds of people in Congress would willingly subjugate themselves and give up their power. One of the key assumptions was that, and frankly, it's a good assumption if you look at the course of human history, and they were pretty good students of history, that people tend to be jealous of their own power, that they don't want to make themselves weaker. And so, one of the most common questions I get is, what would the founders think if they came back today? And there's a lot that would look very similar to them. I just talked about all the parallels of partisanship and how we are viewing so many things through a partisan lens. They would be shocked that Congress was just willing to completely give up its authority in every single way. And in fact, so much of the discussion at the Constitutional Convention was, how do you limit the potential dangers of an overly powerful Congress, thinking that that branch was going to be, especially the Senate, was going to be the threat to small d liberal democracy. And so the fact that, as Jonathan said, that so many people have just willingly laid themselves down and given up their constitutional power would blow their stockings off.
Give me a power or three they've just given up. I mean, my problem, Lindsay, is all these people were elected by people who are hotly pro-Trump. And so the House members and the senators, Republican ones, are simply deferring to Trump, as is, I suppose, their right. So what's gone wrong democratically with a small d? I can't see anything. I mean, the voters want what they want.
Well, I think, if we actually get into numbers, I think that those that are radically pro-Trump are probably not actually the majority of most people that voted for most people of Congress. This is partly a problem with our partisan primaries and our gerrymandered system, that a lot of people either don't feel that their voice is recognized, they don't think that there's a point to voting, and a lot of votes are diluted through that system. And that is a red and blue problem. That is not a particular partisan problem. But some of the powers that Congress has given up in past administrations, Republican or Democrat, there is no way that Congress would be okay with having passed a budget and then having the executive branch just say, never mind. Mm-hmm. And in fact, we know that because there had been pushback, and there are therefore cases on the books about past attempts to do so.
And the TikTok thing is weird, isn't it?
Another great example. They passed a law.
You pass a law as though you've done nothing.
Never mind, just kidding.
Yeah.
The other one that I want to point out, because this is not just a congressional versus executive problem, Congress used to take very seriously its ability to check the judicial branch, and in particular the Supreme Court as well. They, until the 1990s, regularly exercised their right to determine jurisdiction over the federal judiciary. They changed the number of people on the Supreme Court over the course of American history. I'm not advocating for that right now. I'm just saying this was at one point something that was done somewhat regularly. And so the fact that Congress is not in any way attempting to assert any of that oversight is something that is a very recent phenomenon.
Greg, what have you to add?
Well, first I do want to put in a plug for Article 3, because I do think that the courts are doing their job, and there are, frankly, I think rule of law in this country is going to depend on a bunch of Federalist Society judges, on the Supreme Court, and on the Court of Appeals. And you may not like all of their decisions. Those who love Humphrey's executor are probably not going to like what this court is going to do with that. But what the court did ultimately got Abrego Garcia back to this country with the way that they handled those issues that went up to them. We saw them make a distinction in not allowing Lisa Cook to be removed during the pendency of the case, as opposed to the other Humphrey's executors things. And I think that we will see this court rule against the administration on IEPA. So I think that the court is doing its job. Congress, though, I completely agree with my fellow panelists. And it's not just now. And again, I really do think it comes back to a tribalism. Chuck Grassley at least has introduced some legislation to try to constrain tariffs, but I have been horrified at the lack of voices speaking out about executive orders directed at law firms, at weaponization of the Justice Department in overt ways that they decried in previous instances. But I also, in doing that, my old law school professor, Barack Obama, illegally appointed people to the NLRB when the Senate was not in recess. The Senate said it wasn't in recess. John Eastman famously admitted to me, ultimately, that if his scheme went up to the Supreme Court, it would lose 9-0. Well, guess what? Barack Obama did lose 9-0 in the Noel Canning decision in an opinion written by Justice Breyer. But not one Democrat in Congress had spoken out in favor of its confirmation prerogatives and said, you can't bypass us while we're sitting here. Not one did. And when I bring up these examples, I'm not doing this to try to be partisan and just to point out flaws on the other side. But there, again, this organization will not be effective if it is just an anti-Trump organization. There's so much to talk about that this administration is doing wrong. But we have to own the places along the way that the road has been paved by voices failing to speak out for those things. And we've got to speak out against all of it. And those who participated in some of those things have to have the humility to come forward and say, you know what, I got that one wrong. I'd have given Benny Johnson so much credit if he had stood up there and said, you know what, while we're fixing all these things, in retrospect, my vote in 2004 to throw out Ohio's electoral votes probably wasn't a good idea. I regret that. I don't think I should have done that. And now let's try to all lock arms in fixing the problem. And when we don't talk that way, we need to win over the middle of the Republican Party to force those representatives in the primaries and things to stand up and say, we're not going to take things like law firm executive orders and weaponization at the Justice Department. We never wanted those things. Those are inconsistent with our character. Those aren't conservative principled. Those aren't the things we stand for. But to do that, we have to reach them in a way that they'll take us seriously when we speak, and that has to be a recognition of the breadth of the problem.
Greg, was Obama a good teacher?
No teleprompters back then. I think he was a very affable guy. He taught Constitutional Law 3, equal protection and due process, which in my view are the two most abused clauses of the Constitution. One of the things that I think that we also need to speak out against, and this is in the media, every time that there is press coverage of some decision by judges, it is almost always covered from the perspective of, do we like the outcome or not? Justice...
Sorry, just a little memory lane. On my side of things, on the conservative side of things, we used to say, the great difference between them and us, a very great difference is we respect the process. We're not results-oriented. We're all about the process. That's the real good, not the mere outcome. Those are the days. Anyway, I want to tell you something. We have about 10 minutes left, and I'd like to spend maybe half of it on sort of leaders and half of it on citizens, not that leaders aren't citizens as well. And I'll make a confession that when I was a kid, I often heard things like, the president sets the tone in this country. I thought, oh, come on. Really? One guy? Top guy in one branch of the government? This is a great big continental nation from sea to shining sea, as Bill Buckley would say. It had at the time something like 220 million people. We're supposed to be a bottom-up society, not a top-down society. The president sets the tone. Give me a break. People should barely have to know who the president is. And I scoffed at this. And then as I got much older, I think the president kind of does set the tone. And leadership matters. And, feel free to laugh. Jay Nordlinger discovers at some advanced age that leadership matters. But it truly does. And I often think of Lincoln, who said that, in essence, you can appeal to the better angels of men's nature or the worse. And it makes it, I wish leadership didn't matter so much. We're supposed to be, we're a nation of rugged individualists, right? Where every one of us has a conscience. Everyone thinks for himself, so on and so forth. Despite all of that, I'll be damned. Leadership matters a lot. And I know that doesn't shock you, does it, Professor Chervinsky?
No, it does not. I think for a couple of reasons. One, of course, when you have an office that's as powerful as the presidency, then of course it's going to have a huge impact on the fabric and the culture of the American people. But I also think the design of the system, going back to the very first days of the Republic, inherently depends on leadership. And I will, draw a page here from my workplace, which is that I think there are two fundamental foundations of what it means to be a republic. The first is civilian control of the military, and the second is peaceful transfer of power.
I've forgotten how to pronounce your last
If you
name.
lose either of them, you are something else. It doesn't necessarily mean it's a broken government or a bad government, it's just something else. And both of those would not have been possible without Washington being willing to defeat multiple attempts at mutinies and military coups during the Revolution, stepping down from power twice at a time when Napoleon was fighting his way back from islands. The age of Napoleon, it wasn't really seen anywhere else in the world to have people stepping down, and establishing what it meant to relinquish power and make the office bigger than one person. That example, of course, was then cherished by all those that followed. And if you don't have that type of leadership example, it is a very good, I think it's an excellent exhibit of how the institutions would just be fundamentally different.
Lindsay, you remind me on this question of norms, and you spoke of the transfer of power. And this is just a symbolic thing, but it never really occurred to me that the president didn't have to attend the inauguration of his successor. It's just something, it was just normal. It was
normal after 1845.
It's normal in our time. Yeah, that does. And that was just kind of shocking to me. It's just that's what we do in this country. Even when there's there's a bitter election. Take the election of 2000. Al Gore sitting there, blah blah blah. Jonathan, I'll give you a grand total of 2 minutes.
To talk about leadership?
Yeah, a subject that many books have been written about. You say whatever you like, Jonathan. Yeah.
I'll just, if I may, preface that with a thought on what my fellow panelists said a minute ago, which is, it is important to understand that the imperial presidency is not new. The term was coined, in the 1970s? And the presidents have been accumulating power in ways that are legal and maybe sometimes not so legal for that and for my entire adult life. And it's completely true that this organization needs to be nonpartisan and committed to the Constitution and the rule of law, and not just be anti-MAGA, anti-Trump. That said, it is equally important, if you're going to survive in the wilderness, you must not confuse tigers and pussycats. And we do need to understand that something quite different is happening now from anything that's happened in the past. The magnitude and the audacity of what's happening now is of the nature, I think, of a regime change, not just a policy change, not just an administration change, And it's pushed things to the point of crisis in a way that no other president, except maybe Nixon in his own bizarre way, but I'd argue that no prior president has done. And so we do need, in my opinion, to be realistic about that. On the question of leadership, I'm going to refer you to the best book I've read in a long time, a true masterpiece. I reviewed it for Ashika Dalmia, who's in the second row. It's called, I think, Anger, Fear, Domination, the Dark Passions and the Power of Political Rhetoric. This is Bill Galston's new book. It is a short book. It is a very deep and powerful book that reminds us of something we'd all forgotten, which is the ability of leaders wielding rhetoric to shape public opinion and to shape, beyond that, public character, and in particular the power of demagogues to do that, something we thought we were immune to.
Thank you.
Turned out not to be.
Greg, and answer Jonathan if you like.
Leadership is so critical here. And first of all, I agree that what we are seeing now is unprecedented. But what I just think we can't miss is that our failure to speak up at the little eroding steps along the way is in part what has enabled us to get here. We have to be jealous about the norms and the good faith requirements that we have in our government. And as I look at the Republicans in Congress now and their failure to speak up, which again isn't new, but I feel like there's a collective action problem and an advanced commitment need. So one voice stands up and they get doxxed by the president and they're going to get primaried and thrown out. So they can't do that. But they do need to have collective action where they get together and in advance of the president doing something. Because once he's done it, then all of the incentives are wrong. But if they get out ahead of some of these issues and say, we would never be okay with a Democrat doing this, and therefore we're just opposed to that, and we will speak out against that if ever a Democrat or Republican does it, because it would be inconceivable to us that it would be okay for a Democrat to do it. That's the terms they have to talk in, and that's fine. But to get out ahead of some of those things, I think it's really important for us to demand advance commitments from our leaders that they will always speak out against X, Y, and Z, because we can never accept it from either party, because it will ultimately erode our foundations.
Thank you, Greg. Here at the end, I just want to say that sometimes people will ask me, what can I do? What can individual citizens do to improve our country, to protect our project, our republic, this experiment? What can I do? And as my usual answer is, to set an example. Be the best person, the best citizen you can be. Set an example. And that's 3 words. What would you all say? That phrase, ordinary citizens, I dislike that phrase. We're all extraordinary, right? But you know what I mean. What can we the people, as individuals, what can we do for our country? Lindsay.
So I think we need to view citizen as a verb, and that can be, of course, vote and participate in the type of collective action that voting is and requires. But also, I think so much of where we are now is we have allowed ourselves to slip into apathy, and the goal of anyone who is trying to conduct regime change or trying to get people to go along with things that break norms and customs is not for them to feel sad or anger, it's for them to feel apathy, because people who are apathetic don't put up a fight. I don't mean violence, I mean a resistance. So citizenship has to be a verb in terms of participation at the local level, participation in local elections, in school boards, in communities, in Boy Scout and Girl Scout troops, in any form of social fabric connection that actually builds the type of norms and customs that we are talking about.
Sweet platoons. And Jonathan.
So much to say, and the clock has 38 seconds. So first I'll echo what Lindsay said. Second, I'll say that one of the reasons so many norms are being broken is that both teams in America think the stakes are existential in every election. And that's driven by a kind of polarization that we've not seen since the Civil War. And there's a marvelous group whose board I used to sit on called Braver Angels, which is one of a lot of civic organizations which are attempting at the grassroots level to depolarize our communities. It turns out we are much less divided than we believe. People have exaggerated 2x the extent to which the other side is extreme and different in its preferences and policies from themselves. And I encourage people to get involved. That's a root cause. Some of my friends mock the No Kings rallies because they won't really change anything. I don't think that's true. I think we're here to talk about norms, and the way you defend norms is by saying this is not normal. And reminding yourself and other people in highly visible ways, and not just once, but in a continuing basis, this is not normal. When we show that to each other, we also show it to our society and to our kids, and that's how we can defend it.
Jonathan, you remind me, I'll take another minute if you don't mind, that on this question of these crisis elections, these existential elections, and never another election. I've always liked the idea of the U.S. on a kind of constitutional autopilot or cruise control, and a nation of laws, not men. This is something I grew up with. It's sort of a kindergarten lesson. We're a nation of laws, not men. But I suppose one could say, not to be cutesy, we're a nation of norms as well. And when these break down, oh baby, the thing about norms is you miss them when they're gone. And then there's this dread phrase, new normal. I so dislike that phrase. I did more dislike that than new normals. It's amazing how quickly old normals can go away and new normals can set in. So, Greg, in your closing remark, you don't have to be as gloomy as I am, but say, of course, what you like.
I'll just keep it short. Demand character, demand virtue, and jealously hold your own to account. That's my recipe.
Jonathan Rauch, Lindsay Chervinsky, Greg Jacob. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.